Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
Believe it or not, and I know most people do not, violence has been in decline for long stretches of time, and we may be living in the most peaceful era in our species' existence. The decline of violence has not been steady, it has not brought violence down to zero, and it is not guaranteed to continue. The first historical decline of violence I call the pacification process. Until 5,000 years ago, humans everywhere lived in anarchy, without central government. What was life like in this state of nature? This is a question that thinkers have speculated on for hundreds of years. Thomas Hobbes famously wrote that in a state of nature, the life of man is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. A century later, Jean-Jacques Rousseau countered that nothing can be more gentle than him in his primitive state. While these two gentlemen were talking through their hats, neither of them had any idea what life was like in a state of nature. But today we can do better, because there are two ways of estimating rates of violence in non-state societies. There's forensic archaeology. What proportion of prehistoric skeletons have signs of violent trauma, such as bashed-in skulls, decapitations, arrowheads embedded in bones, or mummies found with ropes around their necks? The second way of estimating violence in non-state societies comes from ethnographic vital statistics. The wave of government that spilled out over the world starting 5,000 years ago left a few pockets of the earth still in anarchy, namely hunter-gatherer and hunter-horticultural tribes, and ethnographers who've lived with them have estimated the percentage of them that die in warfare per population. The average is 524 war deaths per 100,000 people per year. That is, a 0.5% of the population is killed every year in war. Let's compare that figure to those from some particularly violent modern states, such as Germany in the 20th century, 2 world wars, and it comes in at 160 per 100,000 per year. Russia in the 20th century, 2 world wars and a civil war, 140. The biggest estimate that you can get would be for the entire world over the 20th century, aggregating the deaths in war, genocide, and man-made famine, and that comes to about 60 per 100,000 per year. And here is the world in the year 2005, less than a pixel high at 0.6 of a death per 100,000 per year. So not to put too fine a point on it, but when it comes to life in a state of nature, Hobbes was right, Rousseau was wrong. The immediate cause was the rise and expansion of states. It's not that the early kings and emperors had a benevolent interest in the welfare of their citizens, but rather that tribal raiding and feuding are a nuisance to imperial overlords who'd much rather keep the people alive to extract taxes and slaves and soldiers from them. The second historical decline of violence has been called the civilizing process. I took the name from Norbert Elias's classic book, in which he argued that during the transition from the Middle Ages to modernity, there was a consolidation of central states and kingdoms out of the patchwork of baronies and principalities and duchies that had polka-dotted Europe. With it, criminal justice was nationalized. And so the constant feuding among warlords, otherwise known as knights, and brigandage along the highways was replaced by the king's justice. Also during this transition, there was a growing infrastructure of commerce, instruments of money and finance that could be recognized within the borders of the newly consolidated kingdoms, and technologies of transportation and timekeeping that made trade easier to implement. As a result, zero-sum plunder gave way to positive-sum trade. The third historical transition can be illustrated by some of the methods that the early authorities used to keep peace within their borders. Extreme punishments such as breaking on the wheel, burning at the stake, clawing, sawing in half, and impalement. But in a process called the Humanitarian Revolution, these barbaric practices were systematically eliminated. What were the immediate causes of the Humanitarian Revolution? Well, a plausible answer is the rise of printing and literacy. The economic efficiency of publishing a book increased 25-fold prior to the 18th century. These increases were put into practice, and there was an exponential growth in the number of books published per year in England during the 18th century. And there were more people who could read them. For the first time during the 18th century, a majority of the population was literate. Why should literacy matter? Well, there's a reason that this era is also called the Enlightenment, namely that knowledge replaced superstition and ignorance. And once enough of the population is disabused of notions such as that Jews poison wells, heretics go to hell, witches cause crop failures, children are possessed by the devil, Africans are brutish, and so on, it's bound to undermine many rationales for violence. Also, literacy is a technology of cosmopolitanism, of the mixing of people and ideas. And it is plausible that as people consume more fiction and history and journalism, they get into the habit of seeing the world through other people's points of views, and it's possible that that expanded their empathy and decreased their cruelty. The fourth transition has been called the long peace, and it speaks to the frequently heard assertion that the 20th century was the most violent in history. It is certainly true that the Second World War was the deadliest event in human history in terms of absolute numbers. But it's not so clear that it was the deadliest in terms of the percentage of the population that was killed. A man who calls himself an atrocitologist, Matthew White, who has assembled a list of the 100 worst things that people have ever done to each other that we know of. I've scaled them by the population of the world at the time, plotted them on logarithmic coordinates from the year 500 BC to 2000 CE, and the graph shows that World War II only comes in 9th place, and World War I doesn't even make the top 10. And history's worst atrocities were pretty evenly scattered through 2,500 years of human history. The frequency of wars involving a great power has also gone down over the last 500 years. But there's one statistic that goes in the opposite direction for most of this span, and that is the deadliness of wars involving a great power. That is, once a war does begin, how quickly does it kill people? This graph shows the number of battle deaths per nation year, which shows a steady increase as militaries became more efficient and better organized, until 1950, where that curve does a U-turn. And so over the last 2/3 of a century, we've been living through an era in which both the frequency and the duration and the deadliness of wars have all been going down. This zigzag graph shows the aggregate number of deaths in wars involving a great power, and the most recent point is at an all-time low over the last 500 years. Since 1946, there were fewer interstate wars. Unfortunately, there were more civil wars as newly independent states with inept governments defended themselves against insurgent movements, both sides armed, financed, and egged on by the Cold War superpowers. What were the immediate causes of the long peace and the new peace? Immanuel Kant proposed 3 hypotheses 200 years ago in his essay Perpetual Peace, when he argued that democracy, trade, and an international community were all forces that would change the incentive structure and make it less likely that nations would come to blows. More recently, Bruce Russett and John O'Neill have tested Kant's hypothesis statistically and have shown that all of these factors increased in the second half of the 20th century, but more importantly, all of them are statistical predictors of peace. Today, there are more democracies than autocracies for the first time in history. International trade skyrocketed after 1945. And membership in intergovernmental organizations, such as the UN and the European Union, has steadily increased since the 19th century, showing an acceleration after World War II. The final decline of violence I call the rights revolutions, the targeting of violence on smaller scales directed against vulnerable sectors of the population, such as racial minorities, women, children, homosexuals, and animals. The Civil Rights Revolution put an end to the practice of lynching in the United States. Lynchings used to take place at a rate of 150 a year in the late 19th century. By 1950, that had gone down to 0. Well, this raises the question of why violence has declined on so many scales of time and magnitude. And I'm going to suggest that the most likely possibility is that human nature is extraordinarily complex and has always comprised inclinations toward violence and inclinations that counteract them, what Abraham Lincoln called the better angels of our nature, and that historical circumstances have increasingly favored our peaceable inclinations. What are some of our motives for violence? Well, there's pure exploitation, the elimination of a human being that happens to be an obstacle on the path to something that you want, resulting in rape, plunder, conquest, and the elimination of rivals. There's dominance, the urge among individuals to climb the pecking order and become alpha male, or the corresponding urge among groups for ethnic, racial, national, or religious supremacy. And then there are ideologies, such as militant religions, nationalism, Nazism, and communism, that justify violence by their promise of a utopia. What do we have on the other side to counteract these motives for violence? What are our better angels? There's self-control, the ability to anticipate the consequences of behavior and inhibit violent impulses. There's empathy, the ability to feel others' pain. There's the moral sense, intuitions, some of which can increase violence, like tribalism, authority, and Puritanism, but some of which, like a sense of fairness, can decrease violence. And then there's reason, the cognitive processes that allow us to engage in objective, detached analysis. The key question now is, which historical developments bring out our better angels and stay our hands before they can commit bloodshed? One possibility is that Hobbes got it right when he called for a Leviathan, a state and judicial system with a monopoly on violence, which can eliminate the incentives for exploitative attack by punishing an aggressor and canceling out his anticipated gain. That can calm everyone down because not only does Leviathan deter you, but you know that it deters your enemies. And so you don't need to, you are not tempted by a preemptive strike to wipe him out before he wipes you out. You don't have to maintain a belligerent stance of deterrence, and you don't have to carry through on vengeance to make it credible. Outsourcing your vengeance to a third party also circumvents the self-serving biases that humans are prone to. Everyone always believes that their opponent's attacks are unprovoked aggression, but that their own attacks are justified retaliation. When you have two sides each believing that, you can get endless cycles of vendetta, which a state, in principle, can tamp down. A second possibility has been called gentle commerce, the idea that plunder is a zero-sum game. The plunderer's gain must be the victim's loss. But trade is a positive-sum game, one in which everybody wins. And that as improving technology allows the trade of goods and ideas over longer distances among larger groups of people and at lower cost, more and more of the rest of the world becomes more valuable alive than dead. Countries with open economies and greater dependence on international trade get embroiled in fewer wars, are riven by fewer civil wars, and host fewer genocides. A third possibility has been called the expanding circle. The idea is that evolution bequeathed us with a sense of empathy, but unfortunately, by default, we apply it only to a very narrow circle of allies, close friends, and family, and cute little babies and other warm, fuzzy things. But that over the course of history, this circle has expanded so that this emotion is now spread over the village, the clan, the tribe, the nation, other races, both sexes, children, and eventually other species. That begs the question of what expanded the circle, and I think the technologies of cosmopolitanism are a plausible cause. The consumption of history, literature, and journalism potentially get people into the habit of empathizing with others, and experiments have shown that if you have a person read the words or listen to the words of some other individual, they become more sympathetic not just to that person, but to the category of people that that individual represents. The second half of the 20th century, which saw the long peace and the rights revolutions, were the era of the electronic global village. And though it's too early to say whether the color revolutions in the Arab Spring will have a happy ending. They certainly were fostered by the internet and social media. Finally, we have the escalator of reason, the possibility that the expansion of literacy, education, and public discourse encouraged people to think more abstractly and more universally. They rose above their parochial vantage point. That made it harder to privilege their own interests over others. It replaces a morality based on tribalism, authority, and Puritanism with a morality based on fairness and universal rules. It encourages people to step back and recognize the futility of cycles of violence, and increasingly to see violence as a problem to be solved rather than as a contest to be won. The final question is why all of these forces seem to be pushing in the same direction. And my best guess is that it's because violence is what game theorists call a social dilemma. It's always tempting to an aggressor to exploit a victim, but of course it's ruinous to the victim. In the long run, since any of us can be aggressors or victims, we should all agree that all parties are better off if violence is avoided. The human dilemma is how to get the other guy to refrain from violence at the same time as you do, because if you unilaterally lay down your arms, you'll be a sitting duck to the other guy's exploitation. One can imagine that over the course of history, human experience and human ingenuity have gradually chipped away at this problem, just like we've worked at other scourges of nature, like pestilence and hunger. And all of the pacifying forces that I have mentioned work to increase the material, emotional, or cognitive incentives of all parties to avoid violence simultaneously. Instead of lamenting, why is there war, perhaps we should ask, why is there peace? Rather than, what are we doing wrong, perhaps we should ask, what have we been doing right? Because we have been doing something right, and it sure would be good to find out what exactly it is. Now, everyone acknowledges that modernity has brought us many gifts, such as longer and healthier lives, less ignorance and superstition, and richer experiences. But there's always been a current of nostalgia and romanticism that has questioned the price. Is it worth it if we have to live with the specter of terrorism, genocide, world wars, and nuclear weapons? However, despite impressions, the long-term trend, though certainly halting and incomplete, is that violence of all kinds is decreasing. And I believe that calls for a rehabilitation of the concept of modernity and progress. And it's a cause for gratitude for the institutions of civilization and enlightenment that have made it possible.
In a world of nuclear weapons, an overcrowded world, isn't violence, isn't war a black swan? That is to say, you've talked about all these trends, but isn't the very nature of the thing? And wouldn't this entire theory have been blown out of the window had it not been for tiny decisions that were made around the Cuban Missile Crisis?
I think no prudent person would argue that can't happen, that we could be blindsided by improbable but catastrophic events. On the other hand, it's by no means necessary. While one could say that if it wasn't for a few decisions during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the world would have been blown up, the most recent analysis of the transcripts show that both sides were working very, very hard to back out of a situation that they had blundered into, and that the top leadership knew that there had to be a way out, and they were groping to find it. Also, the counterfactual history can go both ways, because it is true that one can imagine leaders other than Kennedy and Khrushchev that could have led to a catastrophe. One could also have imagined, though, if you're playing the game fairly, that Hitler was gassed a little bit more thoroughly in the trenches of World War I, in which case World War II might never have happened. And then if World War II had never happened, the nuclear weapons might never have been invented. So it's a game that can go both ways. But I hasten to add that I'm not predicting that violence is impossible or that we couldn't get a nasty surprise.
Is there an argument that says that we need a certain amount of violence, just as some people would argue that children need to eat a certain amount of mud when they're young in order to protect themselves from being very vulnerable? And if you look at the prisoner's dilemma, for example, it is, of course, the case that over time, if both sides cooperate, it's the best outcome. But also, that also increases the benefits, the short-term benefits for suddenly defecting, because everyone's assuming that everyone's going to be loyal, and then if you can, in that context, suddenly start cheating, you can get a lot of gains. So is there a danger that we become, in kind of Nietzschean sense, we can become too weak, and we become ourselves then prone to somebody who takes advantage of this?
I do suspect that we're always going to need some amount of violence held in reserve as a deterrent, and the prisoner's dilemma is a very good example. Namely, you can have indefinite cooperation, but there always has to be the threat of defection to keep all sides on that path. So I don't think we're going to ever dismantle the police. I don't think we're ever going to dismantle armies, but it could be that they spend an awful lot of time twiddling their thumbs, and I think that would be a very good outcome.
What about the reasons for social pessimism? We've seen a steady increase in social pessimism, and you have found in the reception that your book has received, which is that when people have heard you, they're convinced, but their initial feeling is this can't possibly be true.
Yes, right.
Why are we socially pessimistic, and why does social pessimism seem to be growing?
I don't know if it's growing, because commentators in earlier centuries, Hobbes and Hume among them, commented on the fact that everyone is always lamenting how much better it was in the good old days. So this may be another example of something that we think is getting worse that really isn't, namely pessimism. As long as violence has not been eliminated, which I don't think it ever will be, there's always going to be enough of it to fill the evening news. And so if your impressions are driven by the events, and we know that it's a property of human cognition that our sense of risk is driven by memory for recent and vivid and dramatic examples, unless you actually consult the statistics, you look at the denominator of the fraction, all of the people that aren't victims of violence, you'll come away with a misleading estimate of the risk. Also, there are moralistic factors at work, that if you're a social critic whose livelihood depends on convincing everyone how terrible things are right now as part of the urge for reform, then good news is bad news. You worry about scaring away supporters, people being lulled into complacency. And in some sense, though, the increased vigilance for violence, which I think has been one of the forces that have driven violence down, has also led to the paradoxical impression that violence is getting worse. And part of it is we're more and more sensitive to smaller and smaller kinds of violence. Entirely new categories of behavior have now been classified as violence, and we worry about them, whereas in the past they were just part of life, like bullying, the new campaign, at least in America, to stamp out bullying in the playground. Well, 30 years ago, that wouldn't have been called violence, that would have been called childhood. So as we become more and more sensitive, our impression of how common it is changes.
So in a sense, social pessimism is the impulse for progress.
In some ways it is, yeah.